My parents said they couldn't afford me anymore. So one rainy night, they left me at an orphanage and never came back. I was 10. I was only 10, but that memory feels burned into my skin, like a scar that never fades. I remember the night so clearly, even though I've tried to forget it for years. It was cold. I remember that first. The kind of cold that makes your fingers numb and your teeth shake. The rain was falling hard. The windshield wipers on my dad's old grey Ford truck were going back and forth, but they couldn't keep up. Water hit the windows like tiny stones. The sky outside was black, not just dark, empty. My dad had both hands on the steering wheel. His jaw was tight, like he was angry, but he didn't speak. I wanted to ask them where we were going, but something in my heart told me not to. I already felt sick. I sat in the back seat, wearing my old hoodie, holding a small backpack in my lap. Inside it, I had 2 t-shirts, a pair of jeans, one book I liked to read. I couldn't hear what he said. My mom finally turned to face me. Her eyes were red like she had been crying earlier, but there were no tears now, and a picture of me with my parents, taken when I was 7. Back then, we smiled. I used to think we were a real family. Now, the silence inside the car was so loud, it made my chest hurt. Things are just hard right now. Your father and I, we need time to get back on our feet. She smiled, but her eyes didn't match the smile. You'll be okay. You're a strong boy. I know you are. My dad came back to the car and stood next to the door. Come on, Ethan, he said, flat and cold. Let's not make this harder than it already is. She looked like someone who had smiled too much in her life, even when she didn't mean it. My shoes landed in a puddle. Rain soaked my hoodie in seconds. I was shivering. That this was just a mistake. My mom sat in the front seat, staring out the window. Her hands were shaking in her lap. She didn't look back at me. After what felt like forever, the car turned down a narrow road lined with trees. I had never been there before. The houses disappeared, and the buildings looked older. The streetlights flickered like they were about to go out. Hi, Ethan, she said, too cheerfully. Let's get you out of the rain, okay? Then we pulled up to a tall iron gate with rust on the bars. They didn't wave. They didn't even look back. Behind it stood a big brick building that looked like a hospital, or maybe a prison. The sign near the front said, Willow Creek Youth Center. I didn't know what that meant, but the way my dad took a deep breath before getting out of the car told me it was NT, a good place. My hands shook as I stared at it. Me, smiling between my mom and dad. I looked so happy. Just emptiness. Cold, hard emptiness. A woman with a long brown raincoat and a clipboard came out from behind the gate. My dad walked up to her and started talking in a low voice. I just lay there, listening to the rain outside the window. I kept hoping I would hear a car pull up, that they had changed their minds, that they would come running through the doors, saying it was a mistake. She said, quietly, Ethan, you're going to stay here for a while. I blinked. Why? I asked. My voice cracked. Where is this place? Her voice was soft, but I didn't listen to what she said. My ears were ringing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I would faint. She didn't answer. She bit her lip and looked away, but I didn't do anything wrong. I said, I felt my throat tighten. Please, I wanted to go home. Her hand reached back and touched my face, gently, but she pulled it away too fast. Like touching me hurt her. I saw other children through a glass door, sitting in silence, eating dinner on metal trays. I looked at her. I waited for her to say she was sorry, that they were going to come back for me. But she didn't say any of that. She opened the door and motioned for me to get out. I hesitated. I stepped out of the car slowly. The woman with the clipboard stepped forward. I didn't move. I turned to look at my parents one last time. When are you coming back for me? I asked. My dad didn't answer. My mom turned away and wiped her face. Then they got back into the car. The engine started. I stood there, frozen in the rain, water dripping from my face, as their car slowly drove away. Just like that, they were gone. The woman led me inside. Inside the building, the walls were grey. The hallway smelled like old socks and cleaning bleach. Kids' voices echoed from somewhere far away. She showed me a small room, a thin mattress, a folded blanket, a locker. This is your bed, she said. You'll meet your roommates in the morning. I nodded, still not speaking. She gave me a small towel and walked away. I sat on the bed and pulled my wet backpack onto my lap. I opened it. My clothes were damp. The photo was bent. I couldn't cry. I wanted to, but nothing came out. That night, I didn't sleep, but no one came. I was 10 years old, and my parents had just thrown me away. The first morning at Willow Creek was worse than the night before. I woke up before the sun came up, confused about where I was for a few seconds. The room was cold, the sheets were thin, and the blanket didn't help much. The only sounds were the clinking of spoons and the occasional loud voice from one of the adult staff members telling a kid to sit down or hurry up. The food was basic: powdered eggs, a piece of toast, and some watery juice. There were no phones, no internet, barely any books. Some were strict and cold, treating us like prisoners. Others just walked through the halls like robots, keeping their heads down. But there was one person, a man named Mr. Jennings, who seemed different. He wasn't young, probably in his 60s, with white hair and kind eyes. He ran the tiny, dusty library in the back corner of the building. Most kids didn't go there. They said it was boring. But one day, during lunch break, I wandered in. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just needed to be alone. I pulled one off the shelf and sat on the floor to read. It was an old book about machines and inventions. I didn't understand much, but I liked the pictures. That day, I stayed until the bell rang. There were fights, bullying, theft. Some kids tried to escape. Others just gave up. I kept my head down. I avoided conflict. Lying in bed, I would stare at the ceiling, listening to distant whispers or crying. Sometimes kids would scream in their sleep. Other nights were completely silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the whole building is holding its breath. I often clutched my backpack close, holding the photo inside like a lifeline. I didn't know why I still kept it. Maybe I thought one day they would come back for me. Maybe I was afraid of forgetting their faces. Maybe I just needed to feel something. I became quiet, invisible, focused. I didn't make friends. I didn't trust anyone. Every time someone tried to talk to me, I'd give short answers. I knew the rule. If they don't know what you care about, they can't use it against you. Mr. Jennings didn't bother me. He just let me sit there quietly. That was the first time I felt safe since I had been dropped off. The rooms were dull, filled with broken furniture and old posters with fake positive slogans like, "You matter, and this too shall pass." And I was just a boy who had been left behind. But nothing felt like it mattered, and nothing passed. Some kids had been there for years. I sat at the edge of a bench and picked at my eggs. I wasn't hungry, but I knew I had to eat. I didn't want to pass out again. I had done that once before when I skipped lunch for 2 days back at home. My mom called me dramatic. I guess now I knew better. For a moment, I thought I was still home, that everything had just been a dream. But when I turned and saw the peeling grey walls, the small steel locker next to my bed, and 3 other boys still sleeping around me, reality came crashing back. Mr. Jennings began recommending stories, biographies of inventors, businessmen, coders, and people who started with nothing. I asked questions, and he answered them. Slowly, he taught me how to search for information, how to take notes, how to teach myself. It was like a new world was opening up, a world where I didn't need anyone's love to survive, just knowledge. He never asked about my past. He never said anything like "you'll be okay," but his silence was full of respect. That meant more to me than any fake comfort. I sat up slowly, my neck stiff from the hard pillow. I looked down at the photo I had hidden under my pillow the night before, the one with me and my parents, and quickly tucked it back into my backpack. It felt like a piece of a life that didn't belong to me anymore. The sound of a loud bell rang through the hallways, sharp and sudden. All the boys in the room jumped awake, used to the drill. I just stared. One of them, a tall kid with messy hair and a bruised cheek, glanced at me and said in a flat voice, I noticed how some boys had little groups, quiet ones, loud ones, tough ones. I didn't belong to any group. I didn't want to. I just wanted to disappear. Better move or you'll miss breakfast. They don't let you eat if you're late. I didn't know his name yet, but he didn't seem mean, just tired, like he had been here for too long. I quickly slipped on my shoes, pulled my hoodie over my head, and followed them down the hallway. The breakfast room was huge but sad. Long metal tables lined the space, and kids sat quietly, eating from plastic trays. No one smiled. No one laughed. Nobody talked to me that morning. Some kids stared for a second and then looked away. The days at Willow Creek all felt the same. Wake up early, eat, sit in classes, do chores, eat again, sleep. The staff didn't care much. He looked up from his desk and smiled softly. "You new here?" I nodded. "Name?" "Ethan," I said. "Well, Ethan," he said, standing up slowly, "welcome to the one place here that still has a little bit of peace." I looked around at the shelves. They weren't full, but there were enough books to lose yourself in. From then on, I started going to the library every day. I started with picture books, then chapter books. Of course, not everything in the orphanage was calm. Nights were the hardest, but as the weeks passed, I felt the pain turn into something else. Not peace, not healing, something colder, stronger, like steel forming in fire. I stopped thinking of Thomas and Linda Walker as my parents. They were just two people who made a choice. But I wouldn't stay forgotten, not forever. By the time I turned 16, I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to die in that place. Willow Creek was never meant to be a home. It was a cage. Mr. Jennings noticed how fast I learned, how hungry I was for knowledge. He started giving me old computer books, thick ones with pages falling out. At first, they made no sense, but slowly, after reading them over and over, things started to click. I began to understand code, the language behind the screens, the logic that built the digital world. It was for a statewide coding competition sponsored by a local tech company. High school students from across the state could enter. The winner would get a scholarship to a pre-college tech camp and possibly an internship. I stared at it like it was a golden ticket, but my chest sank. I wasn't in a real high school. I wasn't even sure if I was allowed to enter. It was like discovering a secret map, one that could lead me far away from the dull walls of Willow Creek, a waiting room for forgotten children. Some of the kids there gave up, letting the system decide their future. It was the first time I'd ever slept in a real dorm, seen a campus, or met people who spoke my language code. I met mentors, startup founders, and engineers. Some looked at me like I was strange. Others called me a genius. I didn't care what they thought. All I knew was that for the first time, I wasn't invisible. I was someone, but I was out. I was free. I wasn't someone's charity case. I had earned my place in the world, even if it was at the very bottom. One day he found me fixing a broken USB cable with tape and a paperclip and said, I kept my head low, took freelance tech jobs under fake names, and saved every dollar. I learned more languages. Not spoken ones, but programming languages. Python, Java, C++. While other kids were going to prom or hanging out at malls, I was building apps in my room, crashing on couches, drinking cheap coffee at midnight while fixing bugs. I taught myself everything the world never offered to teach me. I hadn't spoken to them since the night they left me in the rain. I didn't even know where they were now, but something inside me needed to know, not to beg for answers, not to get closure. I built tiny programs, tested them, broke them, fixed them again. I wasn't just preparing for a contest. I was fighting for my life. My hands were shaking. I walked up to the stage and took the certificate, my heart beating like it was trying to break out of my chest. Somewhere in the crowd, I saw a man from the tech company nodding at me, impressed, not to the cold halls, the plastic trays, the hopeless eyes. I begged one of the mentors to help me find work. He offered me a part-time job testing software for his startup. I was only 16, but I worked like a man twice my age. I took online classes during the day, worked at night, and used my paycheck to rent a small room in a boarding house. The orphanage didn't even fight it. They were glad to have one less mouth to feed. That look, that moment, was the beginning of everything. The day of the competition, I was taken in a rusty van with two other kids who didn't even care about the event. We arrived at a big school gym packed with students in clean uniforms, some with laptops better than anything I'd ever touched. I felt small, out of place, but I pushed it down. I wasn't there to fit in. I was there to win. I think it's time you started applying what you've been reading. He let me use the computer during library hours. It was slow, but I didn't care. I used it like it was my last chance. I started learning to code, watching free lessons, writing simple programs, and practicing every day. I was obsessed. Not because I loved it, but because I saw it as a way out. A skill that didn't care where I came from, what my name was, or who had abandoned me. Others got into trouble, hoping maybe juvie would at least be different, not one filled with hugs or family dinners. That dream had died long ago. No, I imagined an apartment of my own, a job, maybe a bank account with my name on it. I wanted to be free, not loved, just free. But me, I was done waiting. I knew no one was coming to save me. No long-lost uncle, no kind couple, no miracle. I had to save myself. My life inside the orphanage had become routine. I kept my head down, stayed out of fights, and spent every free moment in the library. There were no computers for us to use, but Mr. Jennings had one in his office, a dusty old desktop that barely worked. At night, I would lie awake and imagine a different future. Then one day, everything changed. Mr. Jennings handed me a flyer he had printed. Mr. Jennings saw my doubt and said, "I already called them. I told them about you. They made an exception." It was the first time in years that someone had believed in me. For the next 3 weeks, I studied harder than ever. I skipped lunch, I skipped sleep, and I did. When they announced my name as the first place winner, people clapped, but it didn't feel real. The scholarship took me to a summer tech camp at a local university. After the camp ended, I didn't want to go back. Not to Willow Creek. I had escaped. It wasn't glamorous. My room was tiny. My meals were cheap, and I still had nightmares about the night my parents left me. For the next few years, I lived like a ghost, and in the background, a thought slowly started to grow. A quiet voice that whispered at first, but grew louder each day. Find them. I never forgot the people who threw me away. Thomas and Linda Walker. My parents, my betrayers. I wanted to know how they were living, and I wanted to make sure they'd never forget what they did to me. Not ever. Life outside the system wasn't easy, but it was mine. I didn't have much. Just a cheap mattress, a laptop that froze every other hour. And the third was the most important. A freelance gig designing security systems for small businesses. That's where I found my edge. I realized early that most businesses didn't know how to protect themselves online. They used weak passwords, open networks, and outdated systems. So I started learning everything about cybersecurity, not just to help them, but to understand how to break systems and then fix them. It made me feel powerful, like I finally had control over something. But I was building something bigger now, and better interfaces. I started getting attention from small investors, but I refused them all. I didn't want partners. I didn't want people asking questions. I didn't want anyone to slow me down or steer me in another direction. Every dollar I earned, I controlled. Every choice was mine. I registered a company under the name Greycore Systems, a name with no emotion, no hint of who was behind it. My parents, Thomas and Linda Walker, were living just 2 towns away in a nice neighborhood. Big white house, 2 cars, matching patio furniture, smiling holiday photos online. But the worst part, I upgraded my system overnight, added extra layers, a new sun, and pitched it directly to their CEO. I still remembered the look in my mother's eyes. Not pain, not guilt, just distance. I remembered my father's silence, his hand on my shoulder like I was just a task to be finished. I could hear the engine starting as I stood outside the orphanage, soaking wet, heartbreaking, trying not to cry. Within a week, they signed a 2-year contract worth $500,000. Just like that, I crossed the line I used to dream about. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was winning. I hired 2 freelancers under fake names to handle support and code review. I made Greycore look like a faceless tech collective, mysterious, efficient, and unstoppable. My customers didn't know who I was. All they knew was that my system worked better than anything else at that price point. It kept them safe. I made sure my real identity couldn't be traced. I had seen enough in life to know that power is safest when it's invisible. And a part-time job at a tech startup that paid barely enough for food. But I had something far more valuable than comfort. Direction. Every dollar I made went into savings or equipment. I spent my weekends reading about startups, watching tech conferences online, and learning how companies rose and fell. I studied failures more than I studied success. I wanted to know what broke people, what caused collapse, because I had already been broken once. I wasn't going to let it happen again. Every hour I spent coding, studying, and building was a step away from the boy my parents had left behind. I was slowly carving out a life with nothing but my mind and my will. No last name, no family, no safety net, just pure, raw hunger. I worked 3 jobs online under different names, one for testing apps, another for fixing small company websites. I didn't party, I didn't date, I didn't waste money. At 19, I launched my first software tool, a basic but efficient digital lock system that protected small online stores from common cyber threats. I didn't have investors, just a rough website and a simple pricing plan. I sold it for $15 a month. That's it. It started slow. A few sales trickled in. I handled every customer email myself, fixed bugs, and constantly updated the tool. Word spread in small business forums. More people subscribed. By the end of the first year, I had 3,000 users. That was $45,000 a month. And for the first time in my life, I felt real power in my hands. I didn't tell anyone. I kept living the same. Small room, cheap clothes, ramen noodles for dinner. By the time I turned 21, Greycore had grown into a six-figure business. I added more tools, smarter systems. Then came the real break. A mid-sized retail company got hit by a massive data leak, and someone on their board recommended my tool. I took that deal and reinvested everything. I hired a small remote team, paid them well, and kept my name out of the picture. But no amount of success could quiet the old voices. No matter how much money I made, I still remembered the rain that night. So I started digging. I searched public records, real estate listings, social media accounts. It didn't take long. They hadn't gone far. They had a son, not me, not a memory of me. His name was Brandon. He was adopted when he was 5, 2 years after I was dropped off. Their posts called him a gift, a miracle, and the best thing that ever happened to us. I stared at their timeline for hours. Not once did they mention me. It was like I had never existed, like they had erased me from their lives, replaced me with someone cleaner, easier, better. That night, I sat in my apartment and stared at their happy faces on the screen. My heart didn't hurt anymore. It felt cold, heavy, silent. I wasn't angry in the way I used to be. I wasn't crying or shaking. I was focused, calm, controlled. Now it was my turn. I wasn't going to scream or break windows. I wasn't going to show up at their door demanding answers. That would be too easy for them, too loud. No, I was going to do this my way, the quiet way, the smart way, the lasting way. They had left me in the dark, forgotten. Now I would rise in silence and take everything they loved. Success can be loud, but revenge needs to be quiet. After years of fighting to survive, I finally had the tools to take control. Not just of my future, but of the past that haunted me. I had built a company from nothing, earned respect in the digital world under a name that wasn't mine, and made enough money to live 5 lives in peace. But peace wasn't what I wanted. I didn't build all of this to walk away quietly. I built it so I could finally go back and look my past in the eye, not as a broken boy, but as a man they couldn't recognize. The first thing I did was hire a private investigator. The file on him made my chest tighten. Not with anger, but something colder, calculation. He didn't ask to be part of the lie they built, but I wasn't interested in fairness anymore. He was in college now, struggling with his classes, switching majors every semester, and using his parents' money for tuition. He drove a car that they paid for, lived in a dorm they decorated, and called them every Sunday. Their perfect son, the boy they didn't abandon, not a flashy one, someone discreet, a woman named Kelsey Ward. She had a quiet office in downtown Pittsburgh, nothing fancy, just files and discipline. Apparently, he had left after a sudden workplace conflict that wasn't on public record, but it hinted at mismanagement or possible fraud. It was a white house with blue shutters, a swing on the porch, and a small garden in the front, peaceful, neat, pretending to be innocent. I saw Thomas stepping outside to grab the mail. His back was a little hunched now, his hair mostly gray. Linda came out a few minutes later, wearing gardening gloves. They laughed at something, shared a kiss, then walked back inside. Nothing flashy, just enough to place my presence in their neighborhood. Invisible but surrounding. I didn't want attention. I wanted information. A whisper here, a comment there. "Oh, Thomas's son is having trouble in school," one lady mentioned. "Linda seems tired lately." I listened. I remembered. I took notes. I hired contractors to build an office nearby under a fake business name. I had no plans to operate it. I just wanted a window looking down the street where I could see the house where my childhood died, paid for through a mortgage under both their names. Their current financial standing was surprisingly fragile. Through fake names and shell accounts, I purchased small stakes in companies connected to Thomas's old firm. I hired people to dig into his exit documents, and the deeper I looked, the more cracks I found. It wasn't fraud, but it was enough to call into question his work reputation. I let them live their peaceful life, never realizing that their stability was slowly being placed in my hands, one move at a time, one thread at a time. I was building a net around them, not to kill them, no, not that, but to take from them everything they held dear, slowly, quietly, without a scream. If needed, I could make it seem worse. In the corporate world, reputation can collapse in a whisper. Behind the polished Christmas cards and social media smiles, they were 1 or 2 bad months away from serious debt. Their retirement fund had been drained more than once. There were quiet loans from relatives, a small lien on the house 5 years ago. I was the missing chapter in their story, and they had torn the page out years ago. And a pending medical bill tied to Thomas's heart condition. He had taken a payout, enough to buy time, but not enough to live rich. My mother, Linda, was unemployed. She spent her time volunteering at church groups and local shelters, painting the picture of a warm, generous mother. But there was no mention of the child they had abandoned. No one in their social circle even knew I existed. It was a slow process, paperwork, approvals, hidden names, but in the end, I gained control of their debt without them ever knowing. I now held the key to their house, the place they built after tossing me away. I didn't tell her the full story. I simply said, I need background checks on Thomas and Linda Walker. I need everything. Financials, property records, employment, medical, even the neighbors if you can. She raised her eyebrows at the detail, but she didn't ask questions. Her job was to find facts, not reasons. Within a week, she came back with a file that changed everything. My father, Thomas, had retired early from his job at a mid-level accounting firm. They had moved into a large 2-story home in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood just outside Scranton. Not wealthy, but comfortable. And then there was Brandon, their adopted son. It wasn't his fault. That weekend, I drove past their house. I didn't stop. I didn't park. I just passed by slowly, once during the day, once again at night. I didn't feel hate. I felt something worse. It was like watching actors on a stage, performing a play that never included me. But I still remembered every word. And now, I was going to write the ending. I started buying silence first. Then I went after their security. Their mortgage, as it turned out, had been refinanced through a lending group that I quietly acquired 2 months later. And that was only the beginning. I began buying property near them, rental homes, vacant land, a storage facility. I also started making small donations to the church they attended, through aliases, enough to earn influence, to be seen as a generous supporter. I was no longer the boy crying in the rain. I was the man standing in the shadows, learning the language of power. I never spoke their names out loud. I never reached out. They had taught me that silence is a weapon. Now I would use it better than they ever imagined. The trick to revenge isn't fury or speed. It's patience, cold, deliberate patience. Over the years, I had watched enough powerful men fall not because someone screamed in their face, but because someone quietly moved the ground beneath their feet. The golden boy, their savior, their second chance. It looked like a generous public service company offering free digital safety checks for local residents and churches. I placed it right in the middle of their neighborhood, fully staffed, beautifully branded, and funded with a budget 10 times what it needed. I hosted workshops, gave out free consultations, and slowly became a trusted name in their area. So many people chasing success, chasing validation. And me, I already had everything. I had money. I had influence. But none of it mattered unless I made them feel what I had once felt. Not just loss, but confusion. That slow, creeping realization that the world was slipping away from them and they didn't know why. That they weren't in control anymore. Thomas and Linda's church welcomed our services with open arms. I wanted them to wake up one morning, look at each other across the breakfast table. The phase where I stepped into their lives directly, where they would hear my voice again after all these years, but not as Ethan, the boy they left behind, and realized they had no idea when things started falling apart, only that it was happening, and they couldn't stop it. That's the kind of pain I carried for years. That's what they gave me when they drove away from that orphanage without looking back. And now I was giving it back to them, one move at a time. Within a month, my team was handling cybersecurity for their entire congregation. Every donation platform, every email system, every internal network, all secured by my firm. And because of that, I now had insight into their community, their communications, and their private schedules. Again, no one knew who I was. No one saw the strings. That was the beauty of building your empire in the shadows. No one thinks to look for the ghost. I didn't want to hurt him directly. Not yet. I wanted cracks to form between him and the perfect image they had built around him. Our firm issued a misrouted payment refund that appeared to go missing. A fabricated system glitch that made it look like Thomas's church had lost a few $1,000s in donation funds. Panic followed. Thomas, who was now on the board, had to take the blame for not double-checking the vendor. Even though we corrected the issue and found the missing money within days, the seed was already planted. Whispers began. Doubts formed. Thomas's reputation, once quiet but respected, began to crack just enough for him to notice. Meanwhile, I kept expanding. I made quiet purchases in the town, a bakery near their favorite cafe, a hardware store Thomas had visited for years, a lot behind their neighborhood that I planned to turn into a co-working space. I was surrounding them, suffocating them in slow motion, using connections I had quietly built in his college's administration through small endowments. I found out he had been flagged for academic probation. He and Thomas had worked together before the retirement. I arranged for Gerald to receive an anonymous tip about Thomas's old questionable workplace departure. Just a few printed documents, edited enough to stir suspicion, slipped into his mailbox. I made sure he brought it up over coffee. Kelsey told me afterward that Thomas had gone quiet during the conversation. He denied everything, of course, but denial wasn't the point. Doubt was. Every little whisper, every frown from an old buddy, every repair delay or unexpected cost, it all played a part in the setup. And still, I remained invisible. He wasn't failing entirely, but he was falling behind. I made sure his professors received anonymous reports of suspected plagiarism, nothing that could be proven, but enough to require him to redo assignments under supervision. He grew frustrated, anxious, and irritable. On his social media, I saw his once cheerful posts grow less frequent. Then one night, he tweeted something that caught my eye. "Feels like the world is just waiting for me to break." I didn't respond. I simply saved it. Brandon wasn't the target. He was the mirror. I wanted my parents to see the reflection of everything they were afraid to admit, that they hadn't saved anyone, that they weren't perfect, and that their entire world was built on a lie they created when they threw me away. That was the kind of revenge I believed in. Not messy, not noisy, but clean, silent, and irreversible. And so, once I held control of my parents, mortgaged through one of my shell companies, and had indirect influence in their community, I started the second phase of my plan, unraveling their comfort. It began with small things they would never trace back to me. A faulty inspection report delayed their mortgage renewal by weeks. Their insurance company flagged their home for an outdated roof they didn't realize needed repairs. A local contractor, someone I paid handsomely, showed up at their door with bad news and a smile, quoting a repair job that would cost more than they could afford up front. Naturally, this created stress. I saw it reflected in the way Linda walked, in the growing bags under Thomas's eyes when he stepped outside for the paper. To them, it felt like life was being unfair again. To me, it was chess. I began placing subtle pressure on Brandon next. Meanwhile, I launched a new project under Greycore, a community cyber audit firm. With all the pieces moving into place, I arranged a mistake. During this time, I had my investigator follow up with one of their old friends, a man named Gerald, someone I vaguely remembered from my early childhood. In the rare moments I allowed myself to pause, I would sit alone in my penthouse apartment, the one no one knew I owned, and stare out the window at the lights of the city. I wasn't interested in making them poor. I wasn't interested in hurting them physically. My goal was deeper than that. I wanted to break the fantasy. The final phase hadn't started yet. That would come later. No, they would hear me as someone else entirely, someone they could never escape. It had been over a decade since I had spoken to them, more than 10 years since I had looked either of them in the eye, since I had heard their voices say my name. It couldn't happen by accident or in public, where they could escape into confusion or pity. It had to be personal. So I created an invitation, disguised as a business opportunity. I sent it through my company, Greycore Systems, offering Thomas and Linda Walker an invitation to a private client appreciation dinner for local residents who had used or referred our services through the church. A dinner at an upscale downtown hotel, the kind where wealthy people gather, dressed in soft fabrics and fake smiles, sipping wine and pretending everything in their world is fine. There was polite applause, forks pausing mid-air, eyes turning toward the front. I cleared my throat and began to speak, thanking our clients for their support, speaking in the practiced tone of someone used to being listened to. And then, in the middle of my speech, I said it. Tonight is special, not just for business, but for something personal, because two very important guests are here. People I haven't seen since I was 10 years old. My parents, I knew they would attend. The invitation was generous. The hotel was prestigious, and more importantly, it was from someone they trusted. But at table 4, Linda froze. Her glass stopped midway to her lips. Thomas's eyes narrowed, confused at first, then suspicious. I stepped off the stage and began walking toward them. And now, I was finally ready to break the silence. But not with rage, not with tears. I didn't want an apology. I wanted understanding. I wanted them to sit across from me, recognize what they did, and feel the shame of knowing they had abandoned their own blood for the illusion of peace. The kind of silence that presses against your ears like a heavy fog. They had lived comfortably for too long. Now, I would shatter the lie they had built. I wanted them to see that I was here by choice, not from desperation, but from power. I planned the meeting carefully, down to the second. When the evening came, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I wore a charcoal black suit, clean and tailored. My hair was neat, my face calm. There was no sign of the broken boy they had left behind, no hints of the orphan, the dropout, the forgotten. I didn't want them to see someone seeking approval. I wanted them to see a stranger, a man they couldn't place, but would never forget once they knew who I was. They arrived on time. Thomas walked in first, proud and stiff, adjusting his collar like he was trying to look more important than he was. Linda followed, smiling politely at the receptionist, her eyes scanning the room for someone familiar. They didn't know I was already watching them from a side lounge behind tinted glass. I gave them time to settle into the illusion, gave them wine, a table near the stage, a view of the city lights. Then I made my entrance. I walked onto the small stage at the front of the room as the host announced my title, founder and CEO of Greycore Systems. A wave of confusion passed through the room. Some people turned to look around. Some chuckled nervously, unsure if it was part of a speech. As I approached, Linda stood up slowly. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked pale. I could see her hands trembling. "Ethan," she said, barely above a whisper. I stopped beside their table, standing tall, calm, expressionless. "Hello, Mom," I said. Then I turned to Thomas. "Dad." He didn't move. He didn't blink. For a second, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. He was silent. I smiled faintly, not out of warmth, but out of control. "It's been a long time," I said, "but I never forgot you. Not one single day." Thomas finally found his voice. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" "No joke," I replied. "This is what success looks like. The kind you didn't believe I could ever have." Linda sat down, her eyes glassy. "Because I didn't want to carry yours. Not after what you did." She reached for Thomas's arm. "It really is him, in the rain, at the door of that orphanage. He walked away like I didn't exist. I changed my name," I explained. "I built everything under someone else's identity. I had spent years hiding in silence. This moment belonged to me. You'd be better off. You were always so quiet, so serious. We didn't know how to help you." People were watching now, pretending not to stare. But I didn't care. "You left me," I said quietly, locking eyes with my father. He looked down, his mouth tight. "You adopted him 2 years later, paid for his school, raised him, gave him everything I never had. We didn't have a choice. Things were hard. You gave up. You left a 10-year-old child with a backpack and a lie." "Brandon wasn't hard," I said, tilting my head. "Not in one night, not with shouting or anger, but slowly, with doubt, with fear, with that horrible question in your head. When did it all start to go wrong?" Linda finally spoke again, her voice soft, brittle. "With thought," I said, "and I can take it all away." "You didn't even try," I said sharply. "I didn't come here for closure. I came to make sure you understood one thing." She started to cry, but I didn't flinch. "I don't need your tears," I added. "I control the people who fix your car, sell your groceries, and monitor your neighborhood security system. For the last 3 years, I've been rebuilding my life by surrounding yours." Thomas looked up at me, his expression hardening. "And what's that?" "That everything good in your life now, the safety, the community, the comfort, is because I allowed it. Their faces changed. Horror, realization, fear. I own the mortgage on your house. I own the shell company that handles your church's donation platform. Linda whispered. Why? Why would you do this? Because I wanted you to feel what I felt, I answered coldly. Thomas stood up, shaking. You think this makes you strong? You think this is justice? No, I said. This is memory. And with that, I walked away. I didn't look back, because the boy they abandoned was gone. Only the man remained. The next morning, I woke up early, not from habit, but from the stillness that followed the storm. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing against my chest, no silent scream under my skin, just quiet. They were concerned about what had happened at the appreciation dinner. One of the elders had recognized Thomas and asked why his son had appeared to publicly shame him. I told my assistant to give no explanation. Let them wonder. Let the rumors fill in the blanks. In small towns, speculation spreads faster than truth, and with more damage. His message was long, messy, filled with accusations and confusion. He didn't understand what was happening. He blamed me for hurting good people. He told me he had always looked up to his parents, that they had saved him from a life in foster care, that they were heroes to him. I didn't reply. What would I say? That he was living the life they denied me, that his heroes had left their own child on a doorstep in the rain, while he slept in a warm bed they had decorated for him. It wasn't his fault, but it wasn't my responsibility either. I had no intention of destroying him. I just sat there, across the street, engine running, staring at the place where everything had once ended and where something else had begun. The house looked smaller now, older. The paint was chipped. The porch swing creaked in the wind. There were no flowers in the garden anymore, just patches of dry soil. He had learned how to live without it. He had built his empire on silence and scars, and now, standing quietly on the ashes of their peace, he had everything he needed. But if his world was now cracked, maybe it was time he learned what kind of foundation it was built on. If they had chosen me, if they had tried, if they had stayed. I wanted uncertainty to be the air my parents breathed from now on. My real name still wasn't attached to the company. Ethan Walker no longer existed in the public eye. I was now a symbol hidden behind software, code, and contracts, and I preferred it that way. She still volunteered, still smiled for the neighbors, but her steps were slower now, her eyes darker. I knew that look. I had worn it myself for years. It was the face of someone who realized too late what they had done, and that there was no way to undo it. She started going to therapy. I saw the receipts my investigator kept watching quietly, feeding me the truth. I didn't interfere. I didn't push. I just observed, letting the consequences bloom like poisoned flowers. The world didn't need to know the story behind the success, but the people who mattered, those who hurt me, they now understood exactly what I had become. I wanted them to live in the middle of their own collapsing reputation. He had lived too long behind the illusion of control, believing respect and order made him strong. But the truth was, his strength was a lie, held up by fragile image and shallow pride. Without the church board, without his community, without his routine of admiration, he began to unravel. I heard through one of my contacts that he had stopped attending Sunday meetings. His health, already fragile, worsened. He spent most of his days inside the house now, blinds half closed, silent and bitter, just like he had once left me voiceless and unseen, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from completion. Unofficially, we pulled the net out from under them. She begged for a second chance, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. She wrote about how she thought she was protecting me, how she thought placing me in the orphanage was giving me a better life. She mentioned Brandon, how much he reminded her of me, how the decision to adopt him came from guilt, not replacement. I read the letter once, carefully, then burned it. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want excuses. There was no space left inside me for stories trying to justify betrayal. What they had done wasn't a mistake, it was a choice, and choices have consequences. Donations dropped. Online security failed. Automated payments glitched. Everyone connected to Thomas began to question his role. His credibility started to rot, not with an explosion, but with a slow, humiliating leak. And he knew exactly why. He knew I was doing it, and that was the beauty of it. He couldn't stop it without admitting everything. Pride, guilt, and fear formed a prison far stronger than the one they had left me in as a child. I had done what I set out to do. I had looked the people who discarded me in the eye and reminded them that I existed not as a memory, not as a mistake, but as a man who had rebuilt himself from the ashes they left behind. Still, I knew the silence wouldn't last. Fallout never arrives with the blast. It comes later, and it comes slow. Within hours, the calls started. My assistant forwarded the first one from the church board. By midweek, Grey Corps had withdrawn all services from the church and surrounding partners. Officially, we cited a restructuring of contracts. Linda tried to reach out. She sent a letter handwritten, folded neatly, placed in an envelope that smelled faintly like lavender. A week later, I got a message from Brandon. Unlike his parents, he was angry, furious, even. Meanwhile, Grey Corps grew stronger. With every connection I severed in that town, I reinvested in expanding my reach elsewhere. Thomas, however, wasn't built to survive collapse. Linda tried to hold the pieces together, and then, one day, I drove past their house again. This time, I parked. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't knock. For a brief moment, I wondered what might have been different, but that moment passed. Because the man I had become didn't need their love, I started the car and drove away. I didn't look back. There was still more to do. Everything I had done so far had been quiet, strategic, indirect, like water slowly seeping into the cracks of a foundation. My presence had spread through every corner of their lives, without ever needing to raise my voice. But silence alone wasn't enough anymore. It was time to finish what I started, not with fire or violence, but with clarity, with finality. I didn't want them to just suffer. I wanted them to understand. I wanted the last thing they felt when they looked at their lives to be the echo of the boy they discarded, the weight of the sun they chose to forget. I waited until winter arrived, the kind of season that slows everything down, where the cold seeps into your bones and quiets the world. Their house looked lonelier now, the roof still unrepaired, the shutters faded. The town had mostly forgotten about them. Thomas was no longer on the church board. Linda's volunteering had lessened. Brandon had stopped visiting after learning the full story. I made the offer anonymously. The previous owner, a retired widow looking to move south, accepted without question. Within a month, I owned the property. It didn't matter what condition it was in. I wasn't there to live. I had access to the feed, the alerts, the passwords. I never used it to spy. That wasn't the point. The point was that even their desperate attempt to feel safe was built on something I controlled. From Thomas, it was written on yellowing paper, his handwriting sharp and angry. I was there to be close, to remind them that I was always near, always watching. In the release, I listed my real name, Ethan Thomas Walker. It was the first time in over a decade that I had allowed my legal name to be publicly attached to anything. I wanted them to see it. But as I read his words, the trembling strokes of ink, the bitter defiance masked as exhaustion, I realized I had already won. Not just in wealth, or power, or control, but in clarity. They had spent their lives pretending the past didn't exist. They buried me so they could sleep better. But now they couldn't sleep at all, because I was in their walls, in their street, in their memories, not hidden behind a screen, not whispered behind their backs. I wanted them to read it in the paper, see it online, and know without doubt that the sun they had thrown away had risen, not just in life, but in name. I hadn't meant to turn him against them, but the truth has a way of breaking illusions, whether you wanted to or not. They became background noise to a town that no longer admired them, and every time someone asked whatever happened to their son, they would have to pause, swallow, pretend, because the answer was a scar they couldn't cover anymore. Not typed, handwritten, plain white envelope, no return address. He had grown distant, perhaps angry, perhaps lost. Either way, they were alone, exactly where they had left me. I bought the house next door. Every morning you wake up, every door you lock, every time you wonder if someone is watching, you're right, I am. It wasn't for sale publicly, but every home has a price if you know how to ask. But there was nothing illegal about a letter with no threat, no name, just implication. The police knocked on my door next door, but it wasn't my name on the lease. It wasn't my face on the cameras. Donated the proceeds anonymously to the orphanage that had once housed me, not because I forgave them, but because I wanted that place to have something I never did, a future. I left no trace in the town. Grey Corps moved its headquarters to another state. My name returned to silence. but the echoes I left behind in their lives would never fade. I had hired a groundskeeper to live there temporarily, someone paid to play the part. You gave up your son, your truth, your chance. I only made sure you remembered. I had become the signature in every corner of their lives. When questioned, he simply said the house was empty most of the year. There was nothing they could pin on me. The first thing I did was send them a letter. It said, "You left me once, but I never left you." They called the police, of course, reported it as harassment, and still, the fear remained. Thomas installed a security system, one I had written the firmware for 5 years ago. Then came the final act. I arranged for a press release under one of my other companies, detailing the acquisition of a local tech firm I had purchased months prior. A few days after the release, I received a single letter in response. "You've made your point. You've taken everything. What more do you want from us?" I stared at that letter for a long time. What more did I want? For years, I thought I wanted revenge. I didn't reply. Instead, I made one last move. I wrote a letter, the final one. "There's nothing left for me to take. You already gave it away." I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. After that, I vanished again. I sold the house next door under a new shell company. Thomas and Linda continued their slow descent into obscurity. The house aged with them. The neighborhood moved on. And me, I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I simply moved forward. Some stories don't need applause. They just need an ending. And this was mine. For so long, vengeance had been my fuel. It had driven my ambition, shaped my decisions, and given purpose to the pain I had carried for years. Every sleepless night, every quiet success, every silent move in the shadows was part of the same mission, to make them feel what I felt, to tear down the world they had built without me. Just me and the places I had once only seen in books or screensavers. I walked the streets of Prague in winter, sat quietly in a Tokyo cafe, watching strangers move in perfect rhythm, not the way I used to, not with fire. The faces of Thomas and Linda no longer haunted me. Their voices, once thunder in my mind, were now faint echoes. It was from a boy named Lucas Sitzstein, from the same state I had grown up in. His story was painfully familiar. No father, a mother who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't pay rent. He wanted to learn how to code, to make things that matter. I flew out and met him personally, under a different name. That was the real victory. I didn't want him to know who I was. I just wanted him to know someone believed in him. When I left that day, he looked at me and said, "I thought people like you didn't care about people like me." They had become what they truly were. People from a life I had outgrown. That knowledge didn't make me soft. It made me free. Forgiveness never came, but indifference did, and that, in its own way, was more powerful. Hiked alone through the red canyons of Utah, listening to the wind swirl like it had something ancient to say. I stepped down from daily operations at Greycore, handing over control to a trusted team I had quietly trained for years. The company no longer needed me in the spotlight. It was a legacy, no one that would continue without my face attached. I established a new foundation, anonymous at first, focused on giving bright, underprivileged kids access to tech education and mentorship, not as a weapon, not as a tool for revenge, but as a man who had walked through the fire and still chose to build instead of burn. Pain shaped me, yes, but it didn't define me. I took that pain, molded it into something sharp, then laid it down when the time was right. That's the difference between survivors and destroyers. I chose to rise, not just above them, but beyond them. I let them live with what they did, while I lived with what I'd become. I knew what it was like to be left behind. I wanted to be the hand I never had. And somewhere between silence and distance, I began to feel human again, not like a machine designed to strike, but like a person who could exist without bitterness in his blood. And I did. I followed through with every step. But when it was done, when the final letter was sent, the final house sold, the final headline published, something inside me changed. The emptiness didn't return like I feared. What came instead was a new kind of silence. Not the silence of abandonment, but of stillness, of release. I no longer checked the cameras. I no longer listened to their whispers through my network of contacts. I let the dust settle over their lives. I had nothing more to prove. The man I had become stood on his own now, not because he'd hurt those who hurt him, but because he had survived. That realization came slowly, over weeks, maybe months. I kept a private journal, nothing shared or published. At first, It was short entries, observations, feelings I didn't know how to process. Then came stories, memories, not just of pain, but of moments I had buried beneath the anger. A smile from a kind foster parent, a quiet library where I used to hide, the first time I sold a piece of software and realized I didn't need anyone's permission to succeed. These memories weren't filled with rage, they were honest, and that honesty began to heal places inside me that even revenge hadn't touched. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. I had spent over a decade living with a single purpose, and now, without it, I felt weightless. Not lost, but untethered. I had all the tools to build an empire. I had the money, the power, the knowledge, but the question I faced now was one I had avoided for years. What kind of life did I want to build? Now that the ghosts were gone, I began to travel, not to escape, but to breathe. I went alone. No entourage, no press. I started writing. Not code, not scripts, but thoughts. It was during one of those nights, sitting alone in a coastal cabin in Maine, that I realized I no longer thought about them. Eventually, I returned to the city, not to reclaim my crown, but to start something new. One day, while reviewing applications for the foundation, I came across a file that stopped me. I smiled and replied, "That's what I used to think, too." In that moment, something shifted. I didn't just feel healed, I felt useful. I'll never forget what they did. I don't want to, and in the end, not the fear I left behind, but the future I stepped into.